What do you do when the very child you sacrificed your whole life for becomes the one who breaks you? This isn't just a story about a wedding. It's about decades of love, sweat, and sacrifice. A father who gave everything only to stand at the church doors and be told by his own son, "You don't belong here." Imagine working your fingers raw to build a life, selling your own comforts, giving up your dreams, all so your children could rise higher than you ever did. Now imagine walking into what should be your proudest day, only to be humiliated, cast aside, erased. But betrayal has a way of shifting the ground beneath us. And what happened after Frank left that church changed everything, not just for him but for every soul who watched. Because sometimes silence is louder than any shout, and sometimes the one you thought was powerless holds all the keys. This is not just drama. This is blood, sacrifice, betrayal, and the reclamation of dignity. Before we begin, I want to ask you, if you were in Frank's place, could you have walked away in silence, or would you have fought right there in the church? Share your thoughts in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from. Let's see how far this story of family and betrayal travels tonight. Atlanta, 1950. The sun rose golden over red brick houses and cracked sidewalks where barefoot children played chase in the dust. A neighborhood alive with rhythm and resilience. Mothers calling their babies in for breakfast, fathers tightening their ties for work, the church bells echoing through the air as if to remind everyone that faith was not a luxury, but a necessity. It was in this world that Frank Morgan was born, the youngest son of a bricklayer and a seamstress who took in laundry from white families up the hill. Their house was small, 2 rooms, 1 bathroom shared with the family next door, but it was a home woven together by grit, gospel, and the belief that tomorrow could be better if only you worked hard enough. Frank's earliest memories were of watching his father's rough hands guide bricks into place, stacking them until they formed walls strong enough to house another family. He remembered his mother's humming as she bent over a washboard, her voice rising above the scraping of fabric, a melody of hope sung in the key of survival. That was Frank's education long before schoolbooks, the gospel of endurance and dignity. As he grew, Frank carried those lessons into manhood. He wasn't the smartest boy in class, but he was steady. Where others quit, Frank kept pushing. Where others spent their nickels, he saved. His father would say, "Son, men like us don't get to dream much. But we can build. Build right, and maybe the world will have to respect it." By his late 20s, Frank had saved enough to open a small garage on the corner of Ashby Street. The roof leaked, the tools were secondhand, and the concrete floor cracked under the weight of old Buicks and Fords. But to Frank it was a temple. Every car he fixed wasn't just a job, it was proof that he could create something with his own 2 hands, something the world couldn't take away. It was in that garage that he first met Lillian. She came in with her brother's rusted Oldsmobile, standing in the doorway with a patience that caught Frank's eye before her smile ever did. She wasn't loud, not flashy, but her presence filled a room the way sunlight warms a cold morning. Frank fell in love not like a man struck by lightning, but like a tree taking root. Quiet, steady, unshakable. They married in the neighborhood church, where wood pews creaked under the weight of family and friends. Frank wore a plain suit, Lillian a dress sewn by her cousin, and when the pastor said, "Do you promise?" Frank answered with a voice that carried further than the rafters, "Yes." Their vows weren't written on paper but in the way Lillian packed his lunch every morning, in the way Frank polished her shoes before Sunday service, in the way they dreamed together of children who would never know hunger the way they had. Life wasn't easy. The garage demanded 12-hour days, sometimes more. The money wasn't much, and often it seemed to vanish the moment it came in. But Frank and Lillian built a reputation not for riches but for generosity. Frank fixed cars for widows who had nothing to pay. Lillian hosted meals for families who had nowhere to go. They gave because they knew what it was to need. In giving, they became anchors for their community. The years rolled forward, and the Morgans welcomed children. With every small body cradled in his arms, Frank whispered the same silent vow: "You will not want. You will not bow your head. You will stand tall because I will carry the weight for you." He meant it with every fiber of his being. But life, even for the strongest, has a way of bending the spine. Sickness came for Lillian before her time. A cough at first, then weakness, then long days where her laughter faded into silence. Frank sat at her bedside, holding her hand as it grew thin and cold. In those final moments she whispered, "Don't let them forget who they are, Frank. Promise me." He promised. With tears soaking the bedsheets, he promised. And when her chest rose for the last time, something inside him hardened into iron. Frank walked back to the garage that same night, stood beneath the dim bulb that swung overhead, and looked at the grease-stained floor as though it were sacred ground. The children were asleep in the next room, unaware of the hole that had just been torn through their world. From that day forward, Frank was no longer just a man. He was duty in flesh, sacrifice given breath. Every dollar earned at the garage went first to shoes, to food, to schooling. Every moment of exhaustion was hidden behind a smile so his children would never know what it cost him. Frank became both mother and father, worker and protector, a living shield against the storms of poverty and despair. The neighborhood whispered about him. That man, he don't stop. Always giving, always working. One day his kids will rise because of him. And Frank carried those whispers like fuel, never once pausing to think of himself. His love was relentless. His sacrifice unending. He gave everything so his children could walk with heads high. But what Frank didn't know, what no man could ever prepare for, was that one day the very children he bled for would turn their backs. That the seeds he planted with love and sacrifice would be twisted into roots of betrayal so deep, even a strong man might break. Before we step deeper into Frank's journey, let me ask you this. Where are you watching from tonight? Have you ever known someone who gave everything for family, only to be overlooked or even forgotten? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. And don't miss the next chapter, because what's coming will change the way you see Frank's sacrifice forever. The Morgan home was filled with the sound of laughter and the steady hum of sacrifice. Frank made sure of it. Each day began with him rising before dawn, the hiss of the coffee pot, the shuffle of boots laced tight, and the quiet prayer whispered under his breath before he left for the garage. His children, though, only saw the man who came home with grease on his hands and stories tucked in his back pocket. Of all the children, it was Tom, Frank's eldest son, who carried the weight of his father's dreams. From the moment Tom was born, Frank had looked into his eyes and seen not just a baby but a future. This one, he told Lillian, rocking the boy gently, this one will go further than I ever did. And for a time it seemed true. Tom was bright, sharp-minded, a boy whose teachers praised for his quick wit and confidence. The neighborhood kids followed him in games and the elders smiled when he spoke. He was handsome in a way that drew attention early, with Lillian's soft features and Frank's commanding presence. Everyone said Tom was destined for more. But more was a double-edged word. One sweltering afternoon, Frank brought Tom into the garage. The boy was no older than 10, small hands stuffed into pockets as he looked around at the grease-stained floor, the smell of oil thick in the air. Frank bent over a Buick with its hood popped, sweat rolling down his forehead. Come here, son, Frank called. I'm gonna show you something every man ought to know. Tom stepped closer, wrinkling his nose at the mess. Frank smiled, pulling a tire from the rack. He showed Tom where to line the jack, how to crank it steady, how to work the lug wrench in firm, even turns. See? This ain't just about cars. This is about self-reliance. You learn this, you'll never be stranded, never have to wait on another man to come rescue you. Tom tried, fumbling with the heavy wrench. His small arms shook as he struggled to loosen the lug nuts. It's too hard, he muttered, his lip curled in frustration. Frank knelt beside him, patient. Hard don't mean impossible. Everything worth something takes work. But Tom's eyes wandered to the street outside the garage, where kids his age zoomed past on bicycles, free and unburdened. He wanted to be with them, not standing in a sweltering garage trying to twist a bolt that wouldn't move. Why do I need to learn this? Tom finally snapped. I don't want to fix cars. I'm not gonna be stuck here like you. The words sliced through Frank, though he hid it behind a firm jaw. This garage put food on your table, son. This place is the reason you got shoes on your feet and books in your bag. Tom shrugged, looking away. I don't want this life. Frank stood in silence for a long moment, then reached for the wrench himself. He finished the job quickly, the tire rolling smooth back into place. But something heavier than steel had shifted that day, a crack between father and son, small but growing. As Tom grew older, that crack widened. At school, Tom's friends teased him about his father's greasy hands, the smell of oil that clung to his clothes. Other kids' fathers wore suits, carried briefcases, talked about business deals. Tom's father, though respected in the community, was still just the garage man. Tom hated the look of pity or condescension when classmates realized who his father was. At night, Frank would sit at the kitchen table, bills spread out in neat piles, calculating how to stretch dollars across mouths and needs. He'd glance at Tom and see not just his boy, but his hope, the chance for the Morgan name to break free from the grind of survival. Study hard, son, Frank would say. Get yourself that education. Make sure you never have to bend your back over an engine like me. Tom nodded, but inside he bristled. To him, Frank's life wasn't noble, it was suffocating. He didn't want to inherit grease, wrenches, or a legacy of sacrifice. He wanted bigger things. Wealth, comfort, the respect that came not from sweat but from power. By the time Tom was a teenager, arguments between father and son echoed through the Morgan house. "Why you always pushing me?" Tom shouted one evening, slamming his book shut. "Maybe I don't want to live the life you're planning for me." Frank's voice was low but thunderous. "Because I see what you can be. You think I want you under cars your whole life? I'm breaking my back so you don't have to. Don't throw that away." Tom glared, his jaw set. "I'm not you, Dad. And I don't want to be." The words stung worse than the heat of a blowtorch. Frank stared at his son, seeing in his eyes both promise and defiance, a storm he couldn't control. Lillian would have softened the edges, smoothed the fire with her gentle hand. But she was gone, and all Frank had was his unyielding love, a love that sometimes pressed too hard. The community still admired Tom. He was the boy destined to rise, the son of a man who had given everything. But behind closed doors, resentment coiled tighter inside him. The garage was no longer a symbol of survival but of limitation. And though Frank never stopped believing in him, Tom had already begun dreaming of a life that left his father, and his father's sacrifices, far behind. The seeds of betrayal were sown not in a single argument, but in years of silent resentment, watered by pride and the desire for a life Frank could never give. The Morgan house had always been built on sacrifice. Frank's hands were the mortar, Lillian's memory the foundation. Every choice, every dollar, every moment of his life was bent toward the same goal, a better future for his children, especially Tom. When Tom received his acceptance letter to a well-regarded college in North Carolina, Frank felt both pride and dread. Pride because his boy had made it further than anyone in the family ever had. Dread because the numbers didn't add up. Tuition, room, board, they were mountains too steep for a mechanic's wage. But Frank was not a man who backed away from mountains. He began selling off pieces of himself. The record player he and Lillian had bought together, gone. The fine watch his father once gave him, pawned. Vacations, if you could call them that, the little fishing trips by the river with his youngest, disappeared. He stopped going to the doctor even when the pain in his chest grew sharper on cold nights. "It's just old bones," he told himself, ignoring the truth that health was a luxury he couldn't afford. Every dollar he saved was sent to Tom. "Son," he said one evening, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, the tuition bill spread between them like scripture. "This here is my gift to you. You won't worry about money. You just study. You just rise." Tom nodded, but the gratitude was thin, almost reluctant. To him it wasn't a gift. It was expected. Frank's sacrifice was invisible, hidden behind the pride of a father who would bleed dry before letting his children feel lack. When the day came for Tom to leave for college, Frank packed his trunk with clothes, a few homemade meals, and an envelope of cash he had no business giving away. He drove his son to the campus in the old truck, the engine rattling louder than usual, but Frank ignored it. All he saw was the bright future stretching before Tom, the promise that everything he had endured had led to this moment. "Don't forget where you come from," Frank said, gripping Tom's shoulder firmly. His voice cracked, though he tried to hide it. "Make your mama proud." Tom gave a tight smile, already looking past him to the towering buildings and the sea of well-dressed students around them. Frank stood there for a long time after his son walked away, a lone figure with grease-stained hands in a world that smelled of new books and promise. At first, Frank wrote letters every week. Simple words, full of love. Stories about the garage, about his younger siblings, about the old neighbors who asked about Tom daily. "We're all proud of you, son," he wrote again and again. The letters went unanswered. Frank told himself Tom was busy. College life was demanding. But when weeks turned into months, silence began to feel like rejection. Still, he kept writing, his hopes stitched into every envelope. Meanwhile, Tom was living in a world far removed from Ashby Street. His classmates came from families of wealth and prestige. They wore fine clothes, spoke with practiced ease, and never smelled of oil or sweat. When they asked what Tom's father did, Tom hesitated. He avoided mentioning the garage, muttering instead that his father ran a small business. In his heart, shame gnawed at him. Lillian's memory, once a unifying force, now became a wedge. Tom began to rewrite her absence into blame. "If Mama had been here, maybe things would have been different," he told himself. He thought of her gentleness, her soft voice, her way of easing tension. Frank, in contrast, was hard edges and stern words, a man who pushed too much, demanded too much, never allowed weakness. "He doesn't understand me," Tom whispered one night in his dorm room, folding away another unopened letter from home. Back in Atlanta, Frank kept the letters coming. He taped Tom's first good grade to the refrigerator, bragged to the neighbors about his son's achievements, even as his own health quietly slipped further. His chest ached, his knees burned, but he told no one. What mattered was Tom. Always Tom. The garage grew emptier, the work slower. Frank had to let one of his helpers go, unable to pay wages while tuition bills drained him dry. The neighborhood whispered, "He's working himself into the ground. That boy of his better appreciate him." But Frank didn't hear. Or maybe he refused to. His entire world had narrowed to one truth. If Tom succeeded, then every sacrifice was worth it. Yet Tom was slipping further away. He began visiting homeless, calling rarely, always too busy. When he did come back during holidays, he seemed restless, as if the walls of his childhood home were closing in. He criticized the old furniture, the creaking floors, the way Frank still came to the table in his work clothes. "You could have done more," Tom snapped one evening, his voice colder than the December air outside. "Mama wouldn't have wanted you to live so small." The words shattered something inside Frank. He sat there in silence, staring at the son he had poured his soul into, hearing not just anger but contempt. He wanted to remind Tom of everything he had given up, every ache he endured, every sleepless night spent figuring out how to stretch a dollar. But pride, that same pride that built his garage and raised his family, kept him from speaking. Instead, he nodded slowly and whispered, "I did the best I could, son." Tom looked away. The divide between father and son was no longer just a crack. It was a canyon. And while Frank tried to bridge it with letters, calls, and endless sacrifice, Tom kept building walls of silence, shame, and resentment. A house once bound by love was now divided by pride. The Morgan house always seemed quieter without Tom in it, but the silence that followed his college years was different. It wasn't the gentle quiet of a child growing into manhood. It was a hollow kind of silence, full of words left unsaid and letters never answered. When Tom finally came back to Atlanta, it wasn't with a degree framed neatly under his arm or a steady career ahead of him. It was with a suitcase half empty, his pride tucked somewhere between wrinkled clothes and overdue bills. Frank heard the truck door slam late one night and stepped out onto the porch. There was his son, shoulders heavy, eyes sharp but tired, the weight of failure pressed into every line of his face. "Evenin', son," Frank said, steady as ever. Tom didn't answer right away. He just walked up the steps and dropped the suitcase inside the door. "It didn't work out," he muttered, his voice low. Frank didn't press. He didn't ask what had gone wrong or where the money had gone. Instead, he patted his son on the back and said, "You're home now. That's what matters." But the truth revealed itself in pieces. Tom had tried ventures, business partnerships, investments, half-formed dreams that promised quick success. Each one ended the same: debts, broken ties, disappointment. And every time it was Frank who stepped in. He sold another piece of his life, borrowed from friends, and even mortgaged part of the garage just to cover Tom's mistakes. When Tom came to him, shame in his eyes and bills in his hand, Frank never turned him away. "You're my son," he said each time. "We'll fix this." But fixing it came at a cost. The garage, once bustling, grew emptier still. Frank cut back on his own meals to make ends meet. His cough grew harsher in the evenings, his chest tightening in ways he refused to acknowledge. Still, he handed Tom the money, always telling himself it was the last time. Always believing Tom would rise if he just had one more chance. The arguments began quietly, then swelled into storms. "You always think you know better," Tom spat one night, pacing the kitchen floor. "Every time I try something, you act like I can't stand on my own. You want me to be dependent on you forever?" Frank sat at the table, his hands folded, his face calm but weary. "I don't want you dependent. I want you steady. You're chasing shadows, Tom. You don't see that these quick wins cost more than they give." Tom's eyes burned. "You think you're better than me because you spent your whole life under a car hood? I don't want that life. I want more than oil stains and empty pockets." Frank's voice deepened, anger breaking through his patience. "And you think money's all that matters? You think being a man is about flashing bills you didn't earn? Respect comes from work, from sacrifice, not shortcuts." The words hung between them like a curse. Tom's jaw tightened, his fists clenched, and for a moment, Frank saw not the boy he had raised but a stranger. A man hardened by resentment and bruised pride. "You never believed in me," Tom hissed. "Not really. You just wanted me to be you, and I'll never be that." Frank rose slowly from his chair, his frame still strong though age bent his shoulders. He looked his son in the eye and said, voice steady as steel, "I never wanted you to be me. I wanted you to be better. But you don't see that, and maybe you never will. 4 days after, the house was silent again, the kind of silence that throbbed like an open wound. And yet, despite the bitterness, they were still bound by something deeper than words. Blood tethered them, fragile as a fraying rope but unbroken. Tom stayed under his father's roof, ate from his table, slept in the room Frank had kept untouched since the day he left for college. Neighbors whispered about the fights, about the way father and son carried themselves like two storms locked in the same sky. Some shook their heads, others pitied Frank. That man gave everything for that boy, they said. But some children don't see until it's too late. Still Frank held on. He told himself that every man had a breaking point before he found his path. Tom would find his, he had to. The sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the debts, they couldn't all be for nothing. But deep down, beneath the hope, Frank knew the cracks were widening. The foundation he had built with his bare hands and his bleeding heart was shaking. And if something didn't change, it wouldn't just collapse under him, it would bury them both. The first time Frank met Angela, she walked into the Morgan home like she already owned it. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor, her perfume trailing through the air before she even introduced herself. She was polished, sharp, every word measured with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she wanted, and what she didn't. Frank noticed the way Tom looked at her, eyes lit like a boy seeing fireworks for the first time. Love, or at least something close to it, had him by the collar. And Frank, being a father, wanted to be happy for his son. Wanted to believe that maybe this was the beginning of Tom settling down, finding steady ground at last. But it didn't take long for him to realize Angela had no intention of finding her place within the Morgan family. She was determined to build her own world and drag Tom into it, whether he fit or not. Dinner that evening was polite on the surface but sharp underneath. Angela smiled when Frank offered her cornbread fresh from the oven, but her eyes skimmed over the humble spread with the faintest trace of disdain. "This is nice," she said, her voice sweet but laced with something colder. "Tom never told me how traditional your home was." Frank caught the look Tom shot her, a quiet plea for her to stop, but the words had already cut. Traditional. A word meant to sound harmless, but Frank heard what she really meant, old-fashioned. Out of touch. Less than. He forced a smile and nodded. "We keep it simple here. Always have. Simple keeps you steady." Angela's lips curled in a polite smile, but she didn't answer. As the weeks went on, her subtle jabs became sharper. At family gatherings, she'd mention how Tom deserved more. A better lifestyle, finer things, opportunities beyond what he grew up around. She never said Frank's name directly, but she didn't have to. Everyone knew who she was pointing at. Tom, already nursing resentment toward his father, drank in her words like they were truth. He began to shift, his tone with Frank shorter, his defenses higher. Every time Frank tried to guide him, Angela's voice lingered in the background like an echo. "You'll never grow if you stay in his shadow." One evening, Frank walked into the garage to find Tom and Angela standing by the workbench. Tom looked agitated, Angela calm and collected, arms folded across her chest. "He doesn't get it," Tom muttered, his back to his father. Angela's eyes flickered toward Frank, sharp and unflinching. "You've worked hard, Mr. Morgan. No one's denying that. But Tom has bigger dreams. Don't you think it's time to let him live his own life? He can't keep cleaning up grease when there's a whole world out there." Frank wiped his hands on a rag and steadied his voice. "Dreams don't build themselves, Angela. They take work, sweat, sacrifice." He turned to his son. "Tom, you know this." But Tom avoided his father's eyes, his silence more painful than any words. Angela stepped closer, her hand resting on Tom's arm as if to shield him. "Sacrifice has its place, but so does ambition. You want him to follow your way, but maybe your way isn't the only way." For a moment, the garage was heavy with silence, the air thick with the clash of two worlds. Frank saw it clearly then. Angela wasn't just a part of Tom's life. She was steering it. And every step Tom took closer to her seemed to pull him further from the values Frank had bled to instill. It wasn't just about love anymore. It was about control. At the next Sunday dinner, Angela made another remark, this time in front of cousins and church friends. The family had gathered around the table, laughter bouncing through the room. Angela, smiling her flawless smile, leaned in and said lightly, "Tom is going places, aren't you, babe? No offense, Mr. Morgan, but not everyone's meant to stay small." The room fell quiet. Forks hovered midair. Tom flushed red, caught between his fiancée and his father. Frank said nothing. He only looked at his son, not with anger but with the weight of every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every dream he had carried for him. That silence spoke louder than words. And Tom, feeling its weight, shoved his chair back and stormed out, Angela trailing behind him like a queen leading her chosen king. The cracks that had begun years ago were splitting wider now. And Frank, sitting at the head of the table, realized he was no longer just fighting for his son's respect. He was fighting against someone who had already rewritten the story in Tom's heart. Angela had planted her roots deep, and she wasn't letting go. Before we move forward, let me pause and ask you, if you were in Frank's shoes sitting across the table from your child's partner who disrespects everything you've worked for, what would you do? Would you stay silent like Frank, or would you speak up no matter the cost? News travels fast in Atlanta, especially in the tight-knit community Frank had lived in all his life. But nothing spread quite as quickly as the word that Tom and Angela were getting married. The announcement came with all the spectacle Angela loved, glossy engagement photos posted online, a carefully staged brunch with friends and family, and a ring so large it seemed to sparkle even in the shade. Frank heard the official news not from his son directly, but from Sister Johnson down at the church. "Brother Frank," she said one Sunday morning, her voice bubbling with excitement, "I just saw the pictures. Tom and Angela are tying the knot. Isn't that wonderful?" Frank smiled faintly, adjusting his glasses. "Yes, ma'am. It is." Inside his chest tightened. Not from anger, not yet, but from the quiet ache of realizing that his own child had chosen to share this milestone with the world before sharing it with him. Later that week, Tom finally came by the house. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, hands shoved into his pockets. Angela was in the car, waiting with the engine running. "We're engaged," Tom said simply. Frank nodded. "I heard. Congratulations, son." For a brief moment, something softened in Tom's expression. But before Frank could reach for it, Tom cleared his throat and added, "Angela's already started the planning. It's gonna be big, real big. We're thinking of a hotel downtown, something classy. She wants everything perfect." Frank didn't argue. He didn't remind Tom about the cost, or about the family traditions that once shaped weddings in their community. Instead he said, "Tell her I'll help. Whatever you need, I'll make sure it's covered." And he meant it. Behind the scenes, Frank poured himself into the preparations. Quietly, without fanfare, he paid deposits for the venue, the catering, and the flowers. He did it not for recognition but because he believed, hoped, that this was his chance to mend ties. Maybe the wedding could be the bridge that carried father and son back toward each other. Maybe, by investing in Tom's new life, he could finally lay to rest the bitter arguments and resentments of the past. The community buzzed with excitement. Friends, neighbors, even customers at the garage all spoke about the upcoming wedding. "It's going to be something," they said. "Tom and Angela sure know how to make an impression." Frank smiled when he heard it, but deep inside, the weight of exclusion was growing. Whenever Angela hosted planning sessions, brunches with her bridesmaids, strategy meetings with vendors, Frank was absent. When Tom and Angela toured the venue to make design choices, Frank wasn't invited. Even family conversations about the guest list seemed to circle around him, not through him. At the barber shop one Saturday morning, one of the men asked casually, "Frank, you gonna walk your boy down the aisle? You got your tux picked yet?" Frank laughed softly, disguising the sting. "We'll see how they want it. It's their day, not mine." But when he returned home that night and sat at his kitchen table, staring at the stack of receipts and payment slips tucked neatly in a folder, the truth gnawed at him. He had paid for the dream, but he wasn't part of it. One evening, after locking up the garage, Frank decided to bring it up gently. He sat with Tom on the porch, the air thick with the smell of magnolias and cut grass. "Son," Frank began, his voice steady, "I just want to know how I fit into all this. The wedding, I mean. I don't need the spotlight, but I'd like to be a part of it. Your mother would have wanted that too." Tom shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward his phone as it buzzed with Angela's name flashing across the screen. "Dad, Angela has this all under control. She has a vision for the day and, well, it doesn't really line up with—" He stopped himself, biting his lip. "Doesn't line up with what?" Frank asked, his voice low but sharp. Tom sighed. "With how you do things. She wants something modern. Elegant. Not traditional." The words landed like stones. Frank leaned back, his heart heavy. "I see," he murmured. "So, there's no place for me in it?" Tom hesitated, then said, "It's not like that. It's just different. You'll still be there, of course. But maybe just let Angela handle it, okay?" Frank nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He said nothing more that night. But deep inside, the cracks in the foundation widened. The man who had worked himself to the bone, who had given up his health, his comfort, his very soul to secure his son's future, now found himself standing at the edge of the one moment he had longed for, watching it unfold without him. Still he didn't pull back. He kept writing checks, kept answering calls from vendors, kept paying bills quietly and faithfully. Because despite the silence, despite the exclusion, he told himself the same thing he had told himself for years. This is for Tom. This is for family. Even if it meant sacrificing the last pieces of himself in the process. The city was alive with the hum of anticipation as Tom and Angela's wedding drew nearer. Flyers from local boutiques were tucked into mailboxes. Whispers of dress fittings and cake tastings spread through church pews, and everywhere Frank went, people spoke of the big day as if it were a community celebration. But within the Morgan family, shadows stretched long. Angela's influence was no longer subtle. What began as side comments, "Frank won't understand this," or "he wouldn't know how to handle that," grew bolder as the weeks went by. She spoke to Tom in tones that left no room for doubt, her voice low and persuasive, curling into the spaces of his insecurity. One night as they drove home from a vendor meeting, Angela laid it out more plainly than ever. "Tom," she said, adjusting the diamond ring on her finger so that it caught the glow of the streetlight, "we need to be honest about your father. He's not right for this new chapter. I mean, look at him. He's set in his ways. Always talking about hard work and sacrifice. That's not what people want to see at our wedding. That's not the image we're building." Tom kept his hands on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the road. He didn't answer. Angela pressed on, her voice smooth as silk but sharp underneath. "You know how people talk, Tom. They'll see him, old-fashioned, clinging to the past, and they'll whisper. They'll say you're still tied down by smallness, by him. Is that what you want? On your wedding day?" Tom's grip on the wheel tightened. His jaw clenched. He thought of his father sitting alone at the garage, wiping grease from his hands, talking about values no one seemed to care about anymore. He thought of the countless times Frank had pulled him out of debt, the sacrifices made in silence. But he also thought of Angela, radiant and ambitious, her voice promising him a life where he could finally stand taller than the shadow of his father's name. "I don't want gossip," Tom muttered. Angela smiled, triumphant. She leaned closer, her hand resting on his arm. "Then trust me. Let me handle it. This is our future, Tom. And sometimes, to build the life you want, you have to leave some things, and some people, behind." It wasn't just about Frank's presence at the wedding anymore. Angela was rewriting the entire story, casting herself and Tom as the architects of their success, while painting Frank as a relic, someone to be hidden rather than honored. In quiet conversations, Angela convinced Tom that every financial contribution Frank made should be reframed. "This isn't his gift to us," she whispered one night as they reviewed invoices. "This is ours. We're the ones making these choices, building this vision. We need to claim it as ours." So, when deposits were paid, Angela and Tom presented them as their own. When vendors asked who was footing the bill, they smiled and said, "We are." The checks that Frank wrote in private were transformed into public gestures of Tom and Angela's ambition. And Frank, humble, trusting, never corrected them. At the church, neighbors congratulated Tom on his generosity. "You're really stepping up, son," they said. "Your father raised you well." Tom smiled weakly, never admitting that the truth was built on deception. Angela, meanwhile, basked in the praise, her hand on Tom's arm, her eyes gleaming with victory. But at night, when the house grew still, Tom lay awake with the weight of it pressing on his chest. He remembered the evenings when Frank skipped meals so Tom could have more. He remembered the ragged cough his father hid whenever the bills piled too high. And yet, in the morning, Angela's voice returned, soft, coaxing, relentless. "This is for us. You can't live in his shadow forever." Frank noticed the shift, though he didn't yet know the full truth. He noticed how Tom's words carried Angela's cadence, how conversations ended with silences that didn't used to exist. He noticed the distance, the way his son's eyes no longer lingered on him but darted away as though ashamed. Still Frank carried on. He visited vendors quietly, paid balances without a word, showed up to meetings even when Angela turned her smile into a wall. He told himself that weddings were stressful, that tension would fade once the day arrived, that Angela would soften once the vows were spoken. But in his gut, he felt the shadows growing. Late one evening, as he locked up the garage, Frank whispered to himself, "Don't let them take him from me, Lord. Don't let them twist him so far he forgets who he is." The night air was cool, the street empty. Frank stood there for a long moment, alone under the flickering porch light, unaware that in Angela's hands, The story of his sacrifices was already being rewritten, not as love but as liability. And Tom, caught between the man who raised him and the woman who now defined him, was slowly, quietly choosing which voice to follow. The evening of the rehearsal dinner was warm, the kind of golden Atlanta dusk that usually brought neighbors onto porches and children out into the street with jump ropes and bicycles. Frank dressed carefully that night, pulling on his best navy suit, the one he had worn to baptisms, graduations, and church anniversaries. He polished his shoes until the leather shone and straightened his tie twice before finally stepping out the door. He told himself he wasn't nervous, just proud. This was the night before his son's big day, and whatever distance or tension had hung between them, tonight would be about family. It had to be. When he arrived at the hall, the lights spilled across the sidewalk like a beacon. Laughter floated out of the open doors, the sound of glasses clinking and chairs scraping across polished floors. Frank paused for a moment outside, breathed deeply, and then walked inside. But the room fell strangely quiet when he entered. It wasn't silent, not completely, but a hush settled over certain tables, eyes flickered toward him and then away. The kind of silence that wasn't born of surprise but of calculation, of people measuring whether his presence belonged. Frank adjusted his tie again, pretending not to notice. He made his way to the seating area, scanning for his name card. One table, then another. Rows of neatly marked places, bride's family, groomsmen, maid of honor. He looked again, slower this time. His name wasn't there. He stood for a long moment, smiling faintly, the weight in his chest growing heavier with each passing second. Perhaps it was an oversight. Mistakes happened. Angela floated past in a fitted dress, laughter trailing behind her like perfume. She caught sight of him and her smile froze for the briefest second before returning, polished and dazzling. "Oh, Mr. Morgan, I didn't realize you were coming tonight." Frank swallowed. "It's the rehearsal, isn't it? I wanted to be here. For Tom." Angela's gaze slid past him to a group of women at the far table, then back. "Of course," she said, her voice smooth, too smooth. "But the seating is, well, it's very tight tonight. Maybe you can just grab a chair at the back." And then she was gone, her laughter already wrapping itself around another conversation. Frank did as she said. He found a spare chair tucked against the wall where the shadows gathered and sat quietly. He clapped when others clapped, laughed softly when jokes were made, though no one looked his way. Tom caught his eye once across the room. The glance was fleeting, uncertain. For a heartbeat, Frank thought his son might come over, might pull him into the fold, might say, "This is my father, make room for him." But Tom looked down at his plate instead. So Frank sat, silent, holding his dignity like a fragile glass he dared not drop. Midway through the evening, his niece Denise slipped into the chair beside him. She was a sharp young woman, the kind who noticed more than people assumed. She leaned close, her voice low. "Uncle Frank," she whispered, "they've been saying things behind closed doors. Angela, she's been telling folks you're difficult. That you'll cause a scene or embarrass Tom somehow." Frank's chest tightened. "Embarrass him? Me?" Denise's eyes softened. "I don't believe it, but she says it enough, people start nodding along. Some think you weren't even supposed to come tonight." Frank's gaze fell to the tablecloth. His fingers traced the edge of the napkin, steady but trembling underneath. "I see," he murmured. Denise reached for his hand. "Don't let them make you doubt yourself. You've done more for Tom than anyone. Don't let her rewrite that." Frank squeezed her hand gently, offering a tired smile. "Thank you, baby girl. But sometimes, people only remember what they want to." When the evening drew to a close, Frank slipped out quietly, unnoticed. He walked into the night air, the sound of laughter still trailing behind him, echoing like a reminder of what he no longer had. The Atlanta streets glowed under the streetlights as he made his way home. Each step was heavy, but his shoulders remained squared, his chin high. He would not let them see the wound, though it cut deeper than any knife. Inside his small home, he hung his suit back carefully, smoothing the sleeves with hands that had built, repaired, and sacrificed for decades. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring into the quiet, and whispered to himself, "Tomorrow's the wedding. Tomorrow maybe things will be different." But deep down, a voice he tried to silence whispered back, "Or maybe tomorrow the door will close for good." The church was dressed like royalty. Ribbons of ivory and gold streamed down the pews, flowers bloomed in every corner, and chandeliers bathed the sanctuary in soft golden light. It was the kind of wedding people in the community would talk about for years. Not just a union of two people, but a display of wealth, ambition, and status. Frank stood outside for a moment, staring at the doors as guests filed in. Their voices lifted in cheerful greetings, their clothes bright and pressed. He could hear the faint notes of the organ drifting out, carrying the weight of centuries of tradition. He adjusted his tie, the same navy suit he had worn at the rehearsal, freshly pressed. His shoes shone, his shoulders squared. He took one steady breath, whispering under his breath as though Lillian could still hear him, "Our boy's getting married today. You'd be proud." Inside, the church buzzed with life. Laughter, whispers, children squirming in lace and bow ties. The pews were full and people turned their heads as Frank stepped through the doors. A few smiled politely. Others exchanged quick glances, their whispers too soft to catch but sharp enough to sting. Frank ignored it all. His eyes lifted to the altar where Tom stood in a sleek suit, nerves hidden beneath Angela's polished poise beside him. Frank's chest swelled with fragile hope. Maybe today the past could be set aside. Maybe today was about family. He walked slowly down the aisle, each step steady, deliberate. He imagined taking his place among the family seats, imagined the nod Tom might give him, imagined, just for a moment, being seen as the father he had always tried to be. But before he reached the front, Tom stepped down from the altar. His movements were quick, his face tight. The murmurs in the church grew, heads turning as father and son met halfway down the aisle. "Dad," Tom said, his voice low, strained. Frank stopped. His smile wavered, but his eyes stayed soft. "Son, you look sharp. Handsome as your mama always said you'd be." Tom swallowed hard, glancing around at the watching eyes, at Angela whose face was unreadable but firm from the altar. Then he said it, the words that would cut deeper than any blade. "Dad, I'm sorry, but you weren't invited. You need to leave." The air in the church froze. The organ faltered, notes hanging in the air like broken promises. Conversation stopped mid-whisper. Every pair of eyes turned to them. For a long moment, Frank just stood there, staring at his son. His chest rose and fell, the silence stretching. His heart pounded in his ears, but his face betrayed nothing. Finally, he nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. His shoulders squared, his back straightened. Dignity, the last armor he had left. "I see," he said softly. His voice didn't waver. He didn't plead. He didn't argue. He only looked at his son one last time, with a mix of sorrow and love that no one else in the church could fully understand. Then he turned. Step by step, he walked back down the aisle, the sound of his shoes against the polished floor echoing in the hushed sanctuary. He didn't rush. He didn't hang his head. Each step was a statement, each movement a refusal to collapse under humiliation. Some guests lowered their eyes, ashamed for him. Others whispered, their curiosity thick with scandal. Angela's lips curved in the faintest smile, her victory sealed in silence. When Frank reached the doors, he paused for just a second. He lifted his chin, breathed deeply, and then pushed them open. The sunlight outside poured over him, warm and bright, as though the world itself offered him comfort the church had refused. He walked away alone, the sound of bells beginning to ring behind him. But to Frank, those bells no longer sang of union. They tolled like a warning, a reminder of betrayal ringing in his ears. At the curb, he stopped and looked back once. Through the stained glass windows, the colors of the wedding shimmered, but the man who had built the foundation of that day, the man who had sacrificed everything for the groom, was now only a shadow outside its walls. Frank drew a steady breath, squared his shoulders once more, and whispered into the wind, "No me, no wedding." And with that, he walked away in silence, carrying with him the weight of decades, and the resolve that would soon turn silence into reckoning. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Frank stepped through the front door, closed it behind him, and leaned his forehead against the wood for a moment longer than usual. He didn't want to turn around. Didn't want to face the stillness that waited for him. The laughter of the church still echoed faintly in his ears, not because he was there long enough to hear it, but because his imagination was cruel. He pictured the applause, the vows, the cheers all ringing out while he was outside, cut off, erased from the story. He hung his jacket carefully on the back of the chair, though his hands trembled as he did. His hat stayed on his head, shadowing his eyes as though taking it off would make the wound too naked, too raw. The kitchen was dim, the only light spilling in from the street lamp outside. Frank sat down slowly at the small wooden table where so much of his life had unfolded. Late-night meals after the garage, lessons with the kids when they were small, Lillian's gentle voice singing to them when storms rattled the windows. Now silence. On the table sat a shoebox. Plain, worn, and heavy with memory. He pulled it closer, lifted the lid, and stared down at the contents. Inside lay the record of a father's sacrifice. Bank slips, canceled checks, receipts from deposits, transfers, payments, each one a scar carved into his own life for the sake of Tom's. Frank's thick fingers picked one up at random. A cashier's check to the university, dated years ago. He remembered working double shifts that month, his back screaming, his hands blistered from cold tools. He had skipped meals, rationed medicine he couldn't afford, and pushed himself to exhaustion just to keep the payment from bouncing. Don't let them say my boy couldn't finish because of money, he had told himself then. He set it down carefully. Picked up another. A deposit for Tom's failed business venture. He remembered Tom's voice over the phone, desperate, promising this time it would work, promising it would be different. Frank hadn't hesitated. He sold the fishing boat Lillian had saved for, the one she had always dreamed of using for family trips. Then another receipt. Catering deposit for the wedding. Frank closed his eyes, jaw tightening. He could still see the woman at the banquet hall smiling as she took his check, telling him how grand the evening would be. He had left that office feeling proud, imagining his son shining on his big day, imagining being part of something beautiful. And yet, on the day itself, he had been told to leave. His hands trembled harder now, not from age but from the fury of betrayal. Betrayal so sharp it cut deeper than any blade. Everything I got, everything I gave, he whispered into the empty room. And he turned me away like a stranger. The shoebox blurred as tears filled his eyes, but Frank forced himself to keep looking. He needed to see it. Needed to stare down every receipt, every slip of paper, every sacrifice that had been twisted into humiliation. He pushed the box aside, breathing hard, staring at his hands. They were calloused, scarred, the hands of a man who had built a life out of sweat and sacrifice. The hands of a man who had raised a son alone when the world said he couldn't. And now those same hands trembled because of that very son. Frank leaned back in the chair, staring up at the ceiling. The bulb above him flickered, casting the room in shifting shadows. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the weight of loneliness pressing down, heavier than any wrench or tire he had ever lifted. But beneath the grief, something stirred. A slow, steady burn. Resolve. Frank had been humiliated in front of a community. He had been stripped of his seat at his son's wedding. But the receipts, the checks, the payments sitting in that shoebox told a different story, a story of a father who had been the backbone of everything. They had written him out of the wedding, but they could not erase the truth. Without him, there would have been no wedding at all. The silence in the kitchen deepened. Frank sat there for hours, unmoving, the shoebox still open before him. His hat still on. His shadow long against the wall. By dawn, his eyes no longer burned with tears. They burned with clarity. The kitchen silence had spoken. And Frank was ready to answer. If you've ever given your all to someone, a child, a friend, a partner, only to feel invisible in the moment you thought would matter most, share your story in the comments below. Where are you watching from tonight? Your voice matters, and your story could be the reminder someone else needs to hear. 2 hours after Frank had walked out of the church, silence on his lips and fire in his chest, the celebration began to wither. At first it was small things. The florist's delivery van never arrived. Guests noticed the bare arrangements standing awkwardly in half-finished displays, green stems jutting out where blossoms should have bloomed. A whisper passed through the pews, weren't there supposed to be roses? Then the caterer's truck pulled up, idled for a moment and drove away. Confusion rippled down the steps. Inside, Angela's family fanned themselves with church programs, their forced smiles growing tighter as minutes stretched. By the time the pastor stood ready to give the blessing over the reception, staff began pulling tables aside. Trays of food that had been set out in advance were swiftly carried back into the kitchen. One by one, the lights in the hall flickered and dimmed as technicians muttered about incomplete payment authorizations. Whispers grew into murmurs. Murmurs thickened into questions. What's happening? Why are they packing up? I thought this was supposed to be the wedding of the year? Angela's mother, dressed in pale gold and dripping with jewelry, stormed toward the coordinator. Her voice rang sharp through the air. Why aren't the vendors serving? This is unacceptable. The coordinator, pale and trembling, held up her clipboard. Ma'am, I'm sorry. The payments? They've all been canceled. Every last one. The words hung heavy, almost unbelievable. But then the evidence became undeniable. The florist, red-faced, marched into the lobby with bouquets under his arm. The caterer's crew rolled carts of untouched food past bewildered guests. Delivery drivers packed up boxes of wine and spirits, shaking their heads. Angela's family looked around in horror as the lavish dream unraveled in plain sight. Every stitch of glamour was being unpicked, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. And in the corner stood Tom, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the back of a chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. His bride whispered urgently in his ear, her nails digging into his arm. But her words were drowned out by the storm of embarrassment swelling around them. Didn't they pay their bills? Someone whispered too loudly. I heard it was her father who covered it. No. I heard it was Frank. That name. Frank. It hissed and spread like smoke. A guest leaned into another. Wasn't that the man Tom turned away? The father? Another chimed in. I saw him leaving earlier, quiet as can be. Didn't even look back. By now rumors were everywhere. The humiliation cut deeper than any absence of flowers or food. What stung most was the story, that the father who had raised his son, sacrificed for him, funded everything, had been dismissed like a stranger, and without him, the very foundation of the wedding collapsed. Angela's father turned beet red, pointing a finger in Tom's face. You told us you had everything covered. You said your side handled this. Tom snapped back, his voice breaking through the murmurs. I thought it was taken care of. I didn't know he stopped himself, the words choking in his throat. But the pause said enough. The room was alive with it. The father. The payments. The betrayal. Angela's eyes darted around, her polished composure unraveling. Her bridesmaids avoided her gaze, guests pretended to sip empty glasses of champagne, and more than one person reached for their phone, not to call for help but to capture the scandal in real time. By the hour's end, the church looked like a battlefield. Half-set tables abandoned. Stray flowers tossed in trash bins. Guests scattering, shaking their heads in disbelief. Angela's dress shimmered under the harsh overhead lights, but the glow of celebration had dimmed, replaced with humiliation too raw to disguise. And in the heart of it, Tom stood broken, a groom not lifted high but dragged low, not by enemies or strangers, but by the shadow of the father he had spurned. The truth was unavoidable now. Without Frank, there was no wedding. By Sunday morning, Atlanta's West End was alive with whispers. The echoes of Tom and Angela's disastrous wedding had spread faster than the confetti could be swept from the church steps. What was supposed to be a celebration remembered for its grandeur was instead etched into memory as a scandal. At the diner off Ashby Street, the chatter began before the biscuits even hit the tables. Two deacons leaned over their coffee mugs, voices low but insistent. They say Frank pulled every dime out just like that. Canceled the vendors, shut the whole thing down. Now why would a man do that on his own son's wedding day? Across the room, a woman shook her head. Don't you go painting Frank that way. That man gave his whole life to Tom. Y'all remember, didn't he cover half the church renovations? Didn't he buy uniforms for those kids at Booker T. High when the school board cut funding? Frank's no villain. But not everyone agreed. At the barbershop, clippers buzzed while a young man laughed. Sounds like bitterness to me. Old man couldn't stand losing control. Petty way to get revenge. His uncle, sweeping hair from the floor, turned sharp. Don't talk about Frank that way. He buried his wife, raised those kids on his own, worked that garage till his hands bled. If Tom pushed him too far, maybe the boy had it coming. The debate burned through every corner of the community, the church foyer, the grocery store, the steps of the post office. To some, Frank was a tragic figure, a dignified man pushed beyond his breaking point. To others, he was proof that pride could twist even the most generous spirit into cruelty. At the center of it all was Mount Zion Church, where the scandal had unfolded. By Wednesday night Bible study, pews buzzed before the service. Sister Ruth, never known for holding her tongue, leaned in close to the pastor. Pastor, you saw him. He came in dressed sharp, just wanted to be there for his boy. And Tom? Lord, Tom turned him away right there at the altar. How you think that felt? The pastor adjusted his glasses, sighing. It ain't my place to weigh sides, Ruth. But I'll say this, a tree can't grow strong if it cuts off its roots. That young man may have forgotten who watered the ground he's standing on. In the back row, teenagers whispered, their eyes wide with fascination. Did you hear the florist walked out? They say Angela cried so hard her makeup ran. It was like a movie. Even children felt the ripples. At the playground, one boy asked another, why didn't Tom want his daddy at the wedding? His friend shrugged, unsure how to explain a wound carved by pride and betrayal. Meanwhile, Frank moved quietly through it all. He still went to the garage, though fewer customers came by, some avoiding the scandal, others arriving just to peek at the man behind the whispers. He kept his head down, fixing carburetors and changing oil, his silence carrying more weight than words. But silence never stopped the community from speaking. Some said Frank had been right, that a father could only take so much disrespect. Others muttered that he had destroyed his son's future out of spite. Lines were drawn, families debating over dinner tables, church friends disagreeing in hushed but heated tones. And yet, beneath the noise, something else stirred. Respect. Not loud, not obvious, but a quiet acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, Frank had done what many parents only dreamed of, showing the ungrateful child the cost of forgetting where they came from. By week's end, the story was no longer just about a ruined wedding. It had become something larger, something symbolic. People weren't just gossiping about Frank and Tom. They were questioning their own lives, their own children, their own sacrifices. The scandal had pulled back a curtain, exposing the fragile thread between generations. The community's eyes were fixed now not only on Frank, but on themselves. The knock came late, long after the street lamps buzzed to life and the neighborhood had settled into sleep. It wasn't polite or hesitant. It was sharp, urgent, angry. Frank sat in his chair by the window, hat tilted low, the shoebox of receipts still on the table like a silent witness. He didn't move at first, just listened to the pounding that rattled the doorframe. "Open up, Dad. We need to talk." The word Dad carried no warmth. It was spit like a challenge, like an insult wrapped in obligation. Frank rose slowly, his joints stiff, but his eyes sharp. He opened the door. There stood Tom, face flushed, suit jacket wrinkled, tie askew. Rage and humiliation clung to him like sweat. "You ruined everything." Tom's voice was raw. "Do you have any idea what you did? You embarrassed me, you embarrassed Angela's family. Do you know how hard I worked to build this life, too?" Frank cut him off with a look. Calm, steady, the kind of look that stops a man in his tracks. "Worked hard?" he said, his voice low, gravel deep. "You don't even know the meaning of it." Tom shoved past him, pacing the small living room like a caged animal. "Don't turn this on me. You sabotaged your own son's wedding. Who does that? Who's so bitter they can't let go?" Frank didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He walked back to the table, lifted the shoebox and set it down in front of Tom. The lid slid off with a soft scrape, revealing the pile of papers inside. "Look," Frank said simply. Tom glanced down, annoyed, dismissive, until he picked one up. His hand froze. It was a tuition check dated 15 years earlier. He grabbed another, deposit for his first failed business venture. Another, the catering receipt for the wedding that had collapsed just hours before. The pile was thick, damning, undeniable. Frank leaned forward, eyes never leaving his son. His voice cracked, not with weakness but with the weight of years. "Every dime, Tom. Every sacrifice. While you were chasing dreams, I was selling mine. While you were embarrassed by me, I was bending my back so you could stand taller. I skipped medicine I needed. I ate beans when I wanted meat. I sold your mama's dreams of a boat, of vacations, just to keep you going. And this," he tapped the wedding receipt, "this was the thanks I got." Tom's face reddened, his mouth opening, then closing. He tried to speak, but the words caught. The papers in his hands trembled. Frank's voice grew steadier, heavier with every word. "You told me I was nothing but a working man. Too small for the life you wanted. And maybe you're right. Maybe I am just a mechanic with grease under his nails. But let me tell you something, boy. Without me, without these hands, without this sweat," he gestured to the shoebox, "you would have nothing. No schooling. No suits. No wedding. Nothing." Tom threw the papers down, his jaw tight. "I never asked you to do all that. I never wanted your pity, your control." Frank's eyes flashed. For the first time that night, his voice rose, thunder cracking through the house. "Don't you dare call it control. That was love, Tom. That was sacrifice. I gave you everything I had, and you stood at that altar and told me I wasn't welcome. You looked me in the eye and threw me away like trash. That wasn't Angela. That wasn't society. That was you." The room shook with silence after the words fell. Tom's chest heaved, his lips trembling with 1,000 unsaid things. But pride wouldn't let them out. He bent, picked up a few of the papers, crumpled one in his fist and whispered, "You'll never understand. You don't know what it's like to want more than a garage. To want more than being the man everyone pities." Frank's face softened just for a moment. Pain seeped through the cracks of his anger. "Son," he said quietly, "you think I don't know? You think I didn't want more for myself, for your mama, for you? But life gave me this, these hands, this work, this home. I made peace with it. What I wanted was to give you a chance. And you turned my gift into shame." Tom looked away, unable to meet his father's eyes. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, but the apology wouldn't come. He couldn't give it. And Frank finally understood. Some betrayals don't need knives. Some are carved in silence, in the absence of words never spoken. Tom stormed out without another word, the door slamming so hard the window rattled. Frank sat back down at the table. The shoebox still lay open. He reached inside, smoothed out the crumpled paper Tom had left behind, and replaced it carefully with the others. His son had refused the truth, but the truth remained. Blood may bind, but betrayal cuts deeper. The wedding that was supposed to seal Angela and Tom's future ended up cracking open every lie, every ambition, every secret they had tried to polish. By the following week, Angela's family no longer spoke in hushed tones. They shouted. In the living room of their sprawling Buckhead home, Angela's father paced with the rage of a man whose name had been dragged through mud. You humiliated us, Tom. My friends, my business partners, do you know how they laughed at me? Do you know the calls I've had to take? You told us everything was handled, that your side was stable, dependable. Instead, your father pulled the rug from under all of us. What kind of man lets his old man bankroll his wedding? Tom stood cornered, stripped of his usual defenses. Angela sat stiffly beside him, her face frozen in that perfect mask of disdain. But now the cracks showed. I didn't know he'd do that, Tom muttered. His voice was smaller than ever. I thought the payments were set. I thought. You thought. Angela's mother cut him off, her words sharp as glass. We don't live on thoughts, Tom. We live on results. And what you gave us was disgrace. A public scandal. Angela turned on him next. You told me your father was nothing. A washed-up mechanic clinging to old stories. You swore he wouldn't interfere. And yet the whole wedding was sitting on his money? Do you realize what that makes us look like? Tom's face burned red. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He blindsided me. Angela's laugh was cold. No, Tom. He revealed you. You're nothing without him. And now everyone knows it. The words landed harder than any slap. But the fallout wasn't just inside their walls. Vendors, furious at the sudden cancellations, filed legal papers within days. The florist demanded reimbursement for lost arrangements. The caterer sought damages for wasted food. The banquet hall threatened to blacklist both families for breach of contract. The story hit local gossip blogs, and soon whispers of fraud began to circulate. Didn't he claim to pay for it all himself? One post read. Turns out his daddy was pulling the strings. Maybe they tried to run up a big show on someone else's dime. At the garage, Frank kept his silence, working on cars with his sleeves rolled up, the shoebox still resting on the kitchen table at night. But Naomi, his daughter, felt the tension pressing in. She had kept her distance for years, caught between loyalty to her brother and quiet resentment toward her father. But now the scandal forced her to confront what she'd avoided. At work, coworkers whispered in the break room, "Aren't you Frank's daughter? Wasn't that your brother's wedding?" Their eyes lingered with pity and curiosity. At church, a woman touched her arm gently, saying, "Baby, your daddy didn't deserve that." Naomi forced a smile but carried the words home like weights. Finally, late one evening, she drove to her father's house. The same modest home where she'd grown up, where her mother's laughter once filled the halls. Frank was in the kitchen, wiping grease from his hands, when Naomi stepped inside. For a moment they just looked at each other. The silence was heavier than words. "Daddy," she said softly. Her voice trembled. He waited. She swallowed hard. "I've been thinking about Tom. About Mama. About everything. I wasn't there for you. Not like I should have been." Frank's eyes, tired and steady, searched hers. Naomi blinked back tears. "I let him make me believe you were old-fashioned. Too much. I wanted to stand with him because he had dreams. But I see now, those dreams were standing on your shoulders. Without you there was nothing." Her words cracked open the years between them. Frank exhaled slowly, his chest heavy with both sorrow and relief. He didn't reach for her, not right away. But his voice was gentle. "You don't have to choose sides, baby. You just have to see the truth." Naomi nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I see it now." Outside, the world still gossiped. Lawsuits still mounted. Angela's family still hissed and Tom still floundered. But inside Frank's kitchen, a quiet reckoning had begun, not just between a father and his daughter, but between sacrifice and memory, truth and illusion. Tom's betrayal had cut deep, but Naomi's choice could be the thread that began to stitch something back together. For now, the reckoning was not just his. It was theirs. The storm had passed. Not the lawsuits, not the gossip, not the broken glass of reputations shattered across Atlanta. Those things would linger for months, maybe years. But for Frank, the storm inside his chest had settled. For the first time in decades, he was no longer bending, no longer carrying the invisible yoke of proving himself to a son who would never see the cost of his father's sacrifice. The decision had been his and his alone. He could have sued Tom for fraud, for stealing his contributions and parading them as his own. He had every receipt, every slip of paper, every proof of his worth. He could have stood in court and won. But what good was another battle with his own blood? What good was victory if it came with chains of bitterness? Instead, Frank made a quieter choice. He walked into the bank with his shoebox of slips and quietly closed the last account tied to his son. The teller looked at him strangely, a man in worn hands and steady eyes, severing ties not with rage but with calm. Frank carried the money home and in the weeks that followed redirected it. He wrote checks to the church that had stood by him when rumors swirled. He helped fund a scholarship for young mechanics, men and women who reminded him of the boy he once was, eager, hungry, still unbroken by the world. He sent donations to the neighborhood food pantry his late wife had loved. Every dollar he gave away felt like cutting a cord that had once bound him to Tom's shadow. And in that freedom, something remarkable happened. People began to see him again. Not as a bitter father, not as a victim, but as Frank. The man who had always stood tall even when the world pressed him down. Naomi came often now. Sometimes to talk, sometimes just to sit. She brought her children, who ran through Frank's yard with laughter that reminded him of their grandmother's voice. At night, Naomi would stay after they slept, washing dishes with her father like she used to as a girl. "Daddy," she whispered one night, "I don't know if Tom will ever see it. What you did for him. What you gave up. But I see it now. I want my kids to see it too." Frank placed his hand on hers. He didn't need apologies anymore. What he needed was exactly this, the quiet restoration of what was still his. Angela's family? They went silent. Tom? He lived in the wreckage of his choices, unable to escape the whispers that followed him into every meeting, every social circle. But Frank no longer carried Tom's burdens. That was the truest reckoning. One morning as spring settled in, Frank stood in his backyard. The soil was cool beneath his hands as he pressed a seed into the earth. A simple seed, one of many in the small packets Naomi had bought for him. "You need something new," she had said with a smile. He planted rows of beans, tomatoes, peppers, and flowers, things his wife once loved to see by the kitchen window. As he worked, his hands steady, his back strong despite the years, Frank thought about legacy. Not the grand kind, not the kind people bragged about at weddings or in glossy magazines. His legacy wasn't Tom's showy world of chandeliers and marble floors. It was this: the garden, the scholarship fund, the laughter of his grandchildren chasing each other through the yard. The way neighbors stopped him on the street and said, "Frank, you did right." Dignity was not something others gave you. Dignity was something you stood up and reclaimed for yourself. By sundown, Frank wiped the dirt from his hands and sat on the porch. Fireflies flickered in the distance. The rows of freshly planted soil stretched before him, quiet, waiting, full of promise. He leaned back in his chair, breathing deeply. For the first time in years, there was no weight pressing him down, no restless hunger to prove his worth to someone blind to it. He had given everything he could. Now he gave to himself. And in that choice, Frank's story was no longer one of betrayal. It was one of reclamation. The old man had not been destroyed. He had risen, not with fists, not with fury, but with silence, patience, and the unshakable power of a man who knew exactly who he was. As the last light of the day touched his garden, Frank whispered to the earth, not to Tom, not to Angela, not to the whispers of the city, but to the memory of his wife and to the future that still stretched before him. "This time I plant for me. What about you? If you were in Frank's shoes, would you have walked away with silence, or would you have fought harder for justice?" Drop your thoughts in the comments. And tell me, where are you watching this story from? I'd love to know how far Frank's journey is reaching. Because this isn't just Frank's story. This is the story of every parent, every family, and every sacrifice that deserves to be remembered.